Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Martin Howard. Martin is a former hospital consultant and honorary visiting professor at the University of York. He's a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Pathologists and the Royal Historical Society. He's the author of several books, including The Fevered Fight. Today, Martin will discuss the management of injuries and illness during the conflict between Britain and its American colonies. There will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audience. For our online audience, you can post questions in the chat bar, and these will be put to the speaker at the end of the talk. In person, raise your hand and I'll come around with this lovely handheld microphone. Moving on with some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser, usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that being said, I'm now going to hand over to Martin and hope you all enjoyed today's talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to the National Army Museum for the invite. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to the audience for coming out on such a sort of chilly, windy day. So this is The Fevered Fight, a medical history of the American Revolution. It's mainly a talk about war and disease, but I will emphasize some other elements of medicine in the American Revolutionary War, which was fought between 1775 and 1783. In Britain, it's sometimes known as the American War of Independence, but it's the same war. I'm not going to say an awful lot about the military aspects of the war. I'm going to tend to talk about the more medical elements, but it's perhaps worth making a couple of points. Firstly, it was a paradoxical war in some ways. It was a war in which the British won most of the battles, but the Americans won the war. The British eventually just ran out of resources and will. And it was also paradoxical in the sense that there was this sort of seismic struggle for American independence and freedom and liberty. But many of the senior American figures, both politicians and military leaders, men such as George Washington, were slave plantation owners, and they continued to be so in the years after the war. So here's a map of the American East Coast. It shows the 13 colonies, and as you can see, this was a conflict that was fought over a very large geographical area with a substantial environmental challenge both for soldiers and doctors. So in the north, Canada, we have the Arctic wastes of, go back one. In the north here, we have the Arctic wastes of Canada and Quebec, which was a British dependency. And then in the south, completely different challenges, pestilential swamps. We had soldiers in the north with frostbite, soldiers in the south with malaria and heat stroke. So a very varied war in many ways, and plenty of challenges for the doctors of the American and British side. British Army Medical Department in the American Revolutionary War was basically not that dissimilar to that which had started out life in the early 17th century. So by this stage there were three broad groups of officers. The inspectorial class, which were the men who pulled the strings. Some of them were in London, some of them were on the scene in North America. And then there were the medical staff. These were the men who performed in the Army's hospitals. So you had the elite physicians who would have high-flying academic qualifications but were pretty useless in practice because they couldn't operate and they didn't really understand the diseases they were treating. The surgical staff were the staff surgeons. These were the expert operators in the army. They would be in the hospitals and the garrisons. The guys at the bottom of the hierarchy were the hospital mates. These were the sort of hospital drudges, the most junior of junior doctors. Some of them would have little qualification, perhaps an apprenticeship, but nothing more. And then to round off medical staff, there were the apothecaries and the purveyors, the people who brought the drugs to the army and distributed them. Then the largest group were the regimental surgeons, and at the time of the American Revolutionary War, most regiments had a surgeon and two surgeons' mates, and they were later known as assistant surgeons. There we go. I think I've got the hang of this now. The American side was completely different. At the start of the American War, in 1775, at the battles of Lexington and Concord, there really was no proper American army. There wasn't the Continental Army that would eventually evolve under George Washington. This was a battle fought on the American side just by local militias. And it's, I think, striking that at the beginning of this seismic war, this war which would culminate in American independence, the wounded American soldiers at Concord and Lexington were just treated by local doctors, and some of them even received bills for the treatment of their wounds. Despite this sort of embryonic situation at the start of the war, by the end of the war, I think the American service, which was based very much on the British organisation, had reached a quality that was not far short of the British. So that was commendable. Just going to introduce you to one or two individuals. On the British side, it was fairly simple in terms of the leadership. This man was called Robert Adair. He had a slightly unprepossessing title of the Inspector of Regimental Infirmaries, but he was in London, and he was the sort of, if you like, the Surgeon General or the Director General of the British Army Medical Service. He was charismatic, more so than might appear here. He was capable, but he was, I think, to be fair to him, he was under enormous duress about the expenditure of the department, and he complained about the number of vegetables that had to be sent across, the amount of wine, and last of all, the amount of hospital mates. The American side, in comparison, was completely chaotic. There were 4 American Director Generals in the course of the war, and this was the first of them, received some approbation from Washington. Benjamin Church was an experienced American physician who in the early years of the war did his best to sort of try and activate the American medical department. There's lots of infighting between the American regimental surgeons and the hospital surgeons, and he tried to put that right. Unfortunately, he was suddenly accused of criminal correspondence with the enemy, was jailed as a spy. When he was later let out, because the evidence against him was a bit thin, he then died in a shipwreck in the West Indies. And it was a sort of cursed post, really, because the next person who took over from Church was a man called John Morgan, who was a very senior American physician, an academic. He trained in Europe. He was highly conscientious, but was also described as being revengeful. And I think John Morgan was basically burnt out in the early years of the war, trying to provide this competent medical service to what was an enormously increasing Continental Army. And he was eventually brought to earth and sacked by his arch rival, William Shippen. Shippen and Morgan hated each other. They had this long-standing feud that kicked off in the years before the war about professorial posts in the American hospitals. And Shippen took over from Morgan, but then Morgan joined with a man called Benjamin Rush, who you may have heard of. He was a very famous physician in the 18th-century American scene and was an army surgeon as well. And Rush and Morgan then brought Shippen to earth. They accused him of ungentlemanly conduct and also corruption. Again, not much of this was proved, but he had to resign in disgrace. which led to the fourth American director, John Cochrane, who was the only one really who was uncontroversial, and he did a decent job, got on well with Washington, which was important. And as I've said, by the end of the war, he'd sort of improved the standard of medical care in the American army to something equivalent to that of the British. George Washington is worth a mention. Washington, the most famous man in the war, I suppose you'd have to say. He had a medical life, really. He was very lucky to survive his sort of adolescence and early adult life. He fought for the British as an officer in the American Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and he had a near fatal attack of dysentery. He also survived smallpox. This portrait from 1794, so well after the war, allegedly shows his smallpox scars. That was relevant because it meant he had smallpox immunity through the American War. He took a lot of interest in the American medical department, a lot of interest in the organisation of it, and also a lot of interest in preventing disease around military hygiene and so on. So a very influential figure. You could argue he was the man who was most influential in the American medical department rather than any of the doctors. So moving on, I'm going to talk a bit about the surgery of the war, but to appreciate the surgery of the war, you really have to understand something about the wounds. And to understand the wounds, you have to know something about the weaponry that was used. So this is a rare American victory in battle in the Revolutionary War, fought at the beginning of 1777. This is the Battle of Princeton, and you can see Washington rallying his troops. Most of the troops were armed with muskets, and the damage that these muskets did really depended on the range of fire. So they fired mostly just an isolated lead spherical musket ball. Some of the Americans particularly used buchan balls, so it's a larger ball but some smaller fragments. When you were hit by one of these musket balls and you were unlucky because they were highly inaccurate weapons, then under 50 yards you could have a bone broken or you could suffer an immediately fatal injury. In sort of intermediate distance, the lead musket ball flattened out, so you ended up with this sort of conical wound which would do a variable amount of damage. You might survive it. And then at long distance, say 200 yards, the ball had lost so much momentum that it would just bounce off a uniform or kit and might just cause a bruise. Round shot was completely different. This is what we often think of as cannonballs. The artillery injuries were often immediately fatal, as you might imagine. They would often rip off an arm or a leg, lead to amputation. Many of these men wouldn't have got to the hospital. They would have died on the battlefield. And then there was the cold steel, the bayonet, relatively infrequent cause of wounding, but swords which, depending on the way the sword was used and the type of sword, might cause a penetrating injury or might cause a slashing sort of laceration, often to the head and neck. So what was the provision around the battlefield? Well, many of the battles of the American Revolution were fought in the middle of nowhere. We have to remember this was an incredibly rural environment with relatively few large cities. So this is the field hospital at the Battle of Princeton. This is Thomas Clark's farmhouse. And most of the battles, the field hospitals where the wounded soldier were taken, were farmhouses or village meeting halls. Often the situation in battle was quite fluid. So, for instance, in this field hospital was used by both the British and the American Army doctor Benjamin Rush actually performed 4 amputations on British soldiers, remembering he was American, which I think makes the point of something that was a common theme throughout the war. This was a war of atrocities, appalling atrocities, particularly between American rebels and American loyalists. But there was actually good collaboration between the British and the American medical department, and indeed the French and the German medical departments, which I haven't mentioned, but were also, of course, there, the French particularly towards the end of the war. This is another field hospital. This is at the Battle of Brandywine, which was fought towards the end of 1777. This was a British victory. This makes the point that the medical provision had to be very fluid. This meeting house changed sides in the middle of the battle, so it was at the start of the battle American, and then Benjamin Rush was there, as he usually was, and then when the British advanced, the Americans fled under a white flag. The American doctors just managed to escape. So these buildings were highly vulnerable. There was no ambulance service, as there wasn't really in the Napoleonic Wars. This shows the Battle of Bunker Hill towards the beginning of the war, and as you can see, really just entirely improvised removal of wounded men. Often many non-wounded soldiers would, for varying reasons, carried their wounded comrades to the field hospitals and the dressing stations. There were carts for the wounded with the regiments, but they were often the first things to be left behind when the army had to move. So what about hospitals? Well, we mentioned regimental hospitals briefly, or at least regimental doctors. They had their own regimental hospital. We've mentioned field hospitals. There were flying hospitals. These were ill-defined, really, but hospitals that actually followed the army into battle, and they had flying hospitals on both the American and the British side. So they were sort of like highly mobile regimental hospitals, more like regimental hospitals than this hospital, which is the Brethren's house in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is very typical of an American general hospital that was commandeered in the course of the war. These were not purpose-built hospitals. These were hospitals that were just used entirely opportunistically. So very common to be sort of the buildings with religious orders simply because of their size. This hospital was designed to hold 500 men, but in the course of the American Revolutionary War, about 700 was the average occupancy. There was lots of well-meaning regulation, so efforts to drag these hospitals up to some sort of quality, better aeration, more space, trying to limit the number of patients, more specific regulation. Washington brought female nurses into the hospitals. Some of the British hospitals had soldiers' wives as nurses, but they were still, at the end of the day, pest houses. The mortality in the Brethren's house was about 25%. So if you went into that hospital, you had about 3 out of 4 chance of being discharged and a 1 in 4 chance of dying. Benjamin Rush suggested that out of every 10 American soldiers who died, 9 of them died because they'd been in the general hospitals and they'd acquired a disease. So they didn't really, they were necessary, but they were a very evil necessity. This is slightly, just to contradict what I've just said, this was the only purpose-built hospital at Yellow Springs in Ohio. The Americans did innovate a little bit more than the British, perhaps because they were in a younger department and there was a bit more lateral thinking. And this was built on the direction of the American Congress, and it did have a lower mortality rate than most of the other hospitals, which were entirely, which were not purpose-built. And equally, this was also a initiative of the time by a slightly eccentric American surgeon who was widely disliked called James Tilton, and he designed these small hospitals based on Indian huts. They were better ventilated than the general hospitals, much smaller, of course. But a good idea. He also separated the sick from the wounded, which may seem obvious, but wasn't always done. But perhaps because he was regarded as a somewhat controversial figure, this, like the hospital at Yellow Springs, these initiatives didn't really take off. So I'm going to go on and talk about surgery, but before I say anything else, it's worth this may be obvious, but it is still worth remembering to put this in context, that this was surgery without anaesthetic, without antisepsis, without antibiotics, and without blood transfusion. So very different from the surgery that we see in civilian or military life today. And I'm going to present you, rather than just talk generally about surgery, I'm going to present you a surgical report which has come out of the archives, and actually I think gives a more realistic, real-time account of what it was like to be a surgeon in battle, and perhaps some of the medical textbooks of the time, which are highly informative but somewhat idealised, as textbooks tend to be. So this is the Battle of Guildford Courthouse, fought between the Americans and the British in 1781. Just to orientate you, it's in the top right-hand corner there, in Guildford Courthouse. So this was a battle towards the end of the war, when a lot of the battles gravitated to the American south. In the early years, they were mostly to the north. So this is near Hillsborough. It's actually current-day Greensboro. And this was a British victory in the sense that Cornwallis, who was the British commander, Nathaniel Greene was the American commander. The British Army was in control of the field at the immediate end of the fighting. But as one of Cornwallis's senior officers said, this was the sort of victory that ruined an army. This was the sort of victory that meant the British would eventually lose the American Revolutionary War, because you can see the casualty rate. The British actually won the battle in a technical sense, but they had twice the number of casualties of the Americans, and they struggled to raise loyalist troops. It was difficult to get troops across the Atlantic, so you couldn't afford battles in which you lost almost a quarter, well, more than a quarter of your force if you add the killed, the wounded and the missing together. The wounded were left on the field overnight in the rain, because there was no facility to quickly remove them from the field. Probably 50, according to one account by Roger Lamb, very famous memorist of the war. Probably about 50 British soldiers just died on the field overnight. Many of the wounded were eventually taken to this building, which is the Quaker Meeting House at Guildford Courthouse, the New Garden Meeting Hall, to give it its full name. And amongst the wounded there were 64 British wounded who were severely wounded. They hadn't been able to be carried off the battlefield. And they were looked after by this man, the senior surgeon on the British side at Guildford Courthouse. He was called, a slightly odd name, West Hill. And as far as we can tell, he was a fairly typical staff surgeon. Staff surgeons were more senior than the regimental surgeons, and as you can see, he had a steady rise through the ranks, and I think his elevated status and qualifications in later years suggest he was typical, but he was probably quite high-flying as well, and he sort of was cognizant of the need to document what he'd done. The early days of medical arithmetic or statistics were just starting to sort of impinge on military and civilian doctors, that perhaps they should be documenting their practice in some way. Now, rather confusingly, this was a battle won by the British, but Cornwallis had no way of maintaining his army locally, and he retreated towards Williamsburg, leaving Nathaniel Greene, the Americans, in control of the battlefield. So this really was a Pyrrhic victory for the British. And this meant that the British doctors left to look after the wounded all needed, they were effectively prisoners of war, they all needed special protection. So this in the National Army Museum is the pass, which I won't labour it by trying to read it, but basically you can take my word that it's giving West Hill permission to visit the British wounded in the New Garden Meeting House without interference from the American Continentals and militia. And he wrote a report, which is very unusual, because it's not common for surgeons of the late 18th or early 19th century to write this sort of real-time surgical report. Most of the data that you see, for instance, in the Napoleonic Wars by people like Guthrie, it's mostly collected in a slightly retrospective manner. So we've crunched these numbers and simplify on his report. A lot of the wounds were to the body, and this just meant the torso. It's a slightly vague term, and it probably meant like a sort of extensive wound to the torso. And unsurprisingly, then the arm and leg were the next most common sites of wounding of British and some German soldiers. But then you see a very wide range of other wounds. There were 64 men. 1 in 4 had multiple wounds, so that's how it adds up to 83 wounds. The only thing that Hill doesn't really tell us much about is actually the weaponry that caused the wound. So he'll give us the site and the nature of it in the sense of its evolution. But we know from accounts of Guildford Courthouse that this was essentially a firefight. This reenactment really illustrates the general view that most of these wounds would have been musket ball wounds. And these are the 17 men who died. And again, I don't want to sort of go into this into too much detail, but many of these sites do accord with wounds that were thought to be of poor prognosis at the time. So, for instance, very extensive wounds to the body, compound fractures where the bone was broken and broke through the skin, prone to hemorrhage and infection, bowel injuries, which would likely lead to peritonitis from which there was no way back, and arterial injuries, which the bleeding would have been unstoppable because there was no, very unlikely to be able to stem a significant arterial wound. So you can say that a number of these injuries are consistent with our wider knowledge of wounding on the battlefield and the prognosis. What about amputation? Amputation was in many ways the archetypal operation in the late 18th, early 19th century. Still a lot of controversy about its role in battle, the technique, when it should be performed, and so on. It seems there were very few amputations in West Hill's practice. It must be said that his surgical report only started 48 hours after the battle, so he may have missed a few. But only 4 did he document, 3 of the leg and 1 of the arm. Obviously very small numbers, 6%. The American surgeon James Tilton, who I've already mentioned, he felt that surgery became, or amputation rather, became less fashionable in the American army. So it seems that in the course of the war, amputation was never frequently performed, but it fell off. Perhaps this sort of daily practical experiences that many of these men were actually just better left alone with their original wound. So conclusions from that sort of quick run through his report. A lot of different sites of wounding. Multiple wounding was common. About 1 man in 4 would die, usually up to about 2 weeks after the battle. The prognostic factors seem to concur with what we know from contemporary textbooks. Amputation was less performed, rather questioning these soldiers' eyewitness accounts of arms and legs being hacked off everywhere. It doesn't seem it was quite like that in practice. Certainly not at this battle. All the conclusions are tentative, of course, because the numbers are small and Hill doesn't tell us everything we need to know. So the rest of this talk is about disease. And some of the nomenclature is a bit confusing. This is fever. And fever today is what we would regard as a symptom, isn't it? So if you have the flu or something, you have a fever. If you have any infectious disease, you might have a fever. But fever, the terminology in the late 18th century, fever was more like we would use the term cancer today. So about 80% of deaths in the late 18th century in military and civilian life were due to some form of fever. The nomenclature is a little opaque at times. Other times it's quite explicit. So we hear of diseases like typhus. The term scurvy is used, dysentery. So that's quite obvious what we're talking about. Allowing for the some approximations. But other diseases you really need to know. Remittent and intermittent fever was generally malaria, sometimes called bilious fever. Jail or hospital fever was typhus, because it would tended to strike down men and women in confined spaces, so like jails and hospitals. And you can often, from the contemporary record, you can often pick out these individual diseases and identify them. So how many men got sick? I'm listing these to you. Actually, there is one or two additional things I would say. You sometimes see camp disorders mentioned, and they're usually the combination of dysentery, typhus and typhoid, and these diseases tended to like the cold and small spaces, and soldiers particularly being crowded together. Malaria was endemic in all the 13 colonies. It was endemic in parts of England, but it was, as you might imagine, worse in the south than the north. I'm not sure it was the most severe in terms of attrition and deaths, but the most feared disease was smallpox. And the point with smallpox was that the British, in Britain, it tended to be more a disease of children and young people. So many of the British soldiers who went to America had good immunity to smallpox. They'd had exposure. In America, it was more a disease of adults. And many American soldiers were not immune because they come from the American backwoods, and many of the smallpox epidemics were in the cities. So smallpox, which was an existential threat once it struck, was much more of a danger to the Americans than it was the British. And no surprise to see those remaining disorders there. Scurvy wasn't just a disease of sailors. If you had a garrison that was besieged and short of supplies, then soldiers also developed scurvy. So the average sick rates throughout the course of the war at any given time, and these are average rates, 1 in 6 American soldiers would be sick, and slightly less British and German. The reasons for that are conjectural. The Americans, probably the lesser immunity to smallpox may have been one factor, although as we see, steps were taken to try and avoid that. Also, although none of the armies were well accommodated, I think the American troops were more exposed in worse encampments, and even the unhealthy cities that the British often occupied were better than that. So it's probably those two factors allow for a lot of the difference. But sometimes disease was a lot more dangerous than this. This is just very much an average number. So if we just take one example, this is the sick rates in the British Army in the Guards Regiment in the winter of 1779, or late 1779 to be fair, to early 1780. 1779 to 1780 was the coldest winter in American recorded history. And that may have had something to do with this, although as you see, the sick rates actually started to go up in the early autumn, peaking about 26%, which was more than double the average sick rate in the wider army for the whole war. Now, you may say, well, yes, this is bad, but it's not terrible. But we have to remember that the Guards were the elite regiment of the British Army. The only reason I'm showing you the Guards figures is because we have monthly totals. For the other regiments, the British Line regiments, we just have more anecdotal information. And to interpret these, you need to know the average regiment size in North America on the British side was about 470 men. So by late August, in and around New York in 1779, in the 80th Regiment there were 370 men sick and 50 dead. Late August in the 76th Regiment, not much better. By mid-September in the 37th Regiment, there were 200 sick, and mid-October, when the overall epidemic peaked, around 280 men sick and 66 dead. And this epidemic of disease, whatever it was, started to seriously compromise the army and also overwhelm the medical department. There was overall, I would say there's probably about one British doctor for every 200 soldiers in North America as a gross approximation, which was okay when there wasn't an epidemic of disease or a major battle, but in this sort of situation, clearly that was a horrific mismatch. And John Peebles, who was a captain in the 42nd Regiment, notes that there were over 100 sick men in a couple of barns and only one surgeon to attend them. And a month later, similarly, one hospital mate, who was the lowest of the low in terms of likely expertise, was attending 130 to 140 sick on their own. James Cuso of the 37th said that in his regiment there were 200 men sick. We partly know that because of this letter, which is in the Henry Clinton papers in America. This personalises it a little bit more, because you'll see this is a letter written by James Couso in late September 1779, so sort of at the height of the epidemic. But you'll see that the handwriting changes halfway down the letter. And that's because after James Couso had told the Adjutant General, to whom the letter is addressed, all about the 200 plus sick, and in fact there were hardly any officers who weren't sick, the state of the regiment was deplorable, he actually became too sick to finish the letter, and his comrade in the 37th, Alex Cameron, takes over and says, poor Couso hasn't been able to finish the letter because he's had to go to bed sick. So even the cry for help by an officer, he was too ill to get to the bottom of the page. Both Couso and Cameron, actually, as it happens, did survive this epidemic of disease. So what was it? What was devastating the British Army? Well, I think it's tempting to think that rather like Walcheren in 1809, which is another example in the Napoleonic Wars, tempting to think there's some sort of killer disease, some new virus, perhaps a particularly virulent COVID of the 18th century. But what usually happened in these cases when you dissect down is you find there's probably a combination of very well-known diseases all striking together and acting synergistically. So Peebles, the captain in the 42nd, tells us that the disease was a quotidian or tertian intermittent, which is classic contemporary nomenclature for malaria. Ague is the term often used by by the troops for malaria. And we have this hospital board meeting, a rather panicky meeting held by 4 doctors in September as the losses piled up. This is also in the Clinton papers. And you can't read this very well, but it said that the most prevailing diseases were intermittent bilious fevers and dysentery. But there's probably more to it than that. Typhus was not that common in the wider American conflict, but it was quite common in the port cities because it often came in on the boats. And we know at the end of August 1779 that a convoy arrived from England with a lot of men sick, and also with a number of men who'd already died on board. And according to Henry Clinton, who was the officer in charge at the British garrison in New York, this was a malignant jail fever. So again, this is classic nomenclature for typhoid, and Clinton, possibly with some exaggeration, as he was trying to justify his inactivity at the time, said it sent above 6,000 of my best troops to the hospital. And the hospital board agreed. They say here to the bottom of the page that the major cause of mortality was actually amongst the men who arrived in the convoy and carried this so-called contagious fever that they brought with them. So this was a little bit like Walcheren fever. It was a fever that was a combination of typhus, possibly typhoid, because the two are difficult to tell apart, malaria and dysentery. New York may seem quite a northerly place to find malaria, but it could still be quite virulent up to the middle states, although it had its full sort of subtropical impact further south. Unfortunately, this is an American Lancet of the time, unfortunately the attempts to treat disease were based on misguided theories of causation. So they thought that there was a little bit of talk about contagion, but mostly most American and British Army doctors thought that diseases arose from miasma or miasmata, these invisible poisonous substances that rose out of the swamps, especially in the southern states. They had no idea of insect vectors. They complained about the mosquitoes, but they didn't know they caused yellow fever and malaria. Yellow fever, actually, there wasn't much of in the American Revolutionary War, in fairness. They didn't understand that typhus was carried by body lice. It would need the science of microbiology and its understanding of organisms and insect vectors and so on before there was understanding. So they relied on the interventions of antiquity, bleeding, blistering, purging, emetics, and so on. Some of the soldiers just had cold water poured over them. So they were more likely to die than they would have been without the treatment. unless they received Peruvian bark, which is the one thing that really could have helped if they were given enough, the precursor of quinine, and things like opiates, so one or two simple opiates. There were national differences. The French were more nihilistic and more conservative. It was said at the time that the British doctors killed their patients and the French let theirs die. Oddly, and perhaps because it didn't, in some ways, rely on understanding specific causation, just general factors, the attempts to prevent infection to a modern mind appear a lot more sensible than the attempts to treat. And some of this knowledge came from antiquity. So read sort of Roman accounts. There was military hygiene going on, ventilation, good discipline, good diet, scrupulous cleanliness, and doctors such as John Pringle, the very famous British Army doctor, really, in a sense, rediscovered this, and a number of books were published. And there were attempts at the military hygiene on both sides in the American Revolutionary War, although not always successful. Quarantine, we know what that is. It was used, particularly against smallpox. And then there's inoculation. This quite attractive cartoon or lampoon actually addresses vaccination, which is a little bit later than the American Revolutionary War. Vaccination, you get a small dose of cowpox. It's completely harmless, and of course it was introduced, as you know, by Jenner. In the American Revolutionary War, they were still using inoculation, which would take some actual matter from a smallpox victim and inject it into somebody, the inoculated person's arm. What it did was cause an attenuated episode of smallpox. So it was a risky thing to do. But in general, if you caught smallpox in the natural way, the mortality in smallpox epidemics was very variable, but you might say 20 to 30% of people would die of it. But when inoculation was performed well, with isolation and done in a disciplined way, which it wasn't always, then the mortality rates were down around 2%. So inoculation was a great step forward. We've already said American troops were more susceptible to smallpox than the British, and Washington's decision to mass inoculate the American army was probably the seminal medical decision of the war, and probably contributed to the winning of the war. It was a risk because these men were going to have this this mild self-limiting disease, but would still be out of action for a period of time. The severity of these epidemics leads to the obvious question: did disease alter the outcome of the war? Did it make a substantial difference? There are two campaigns where this has been argued. One was the American invasion of Canada in 1776, which was conducted in really appalling, freezing conditions, the American troops very exposed to the elements. And the second is the British invasion of the South under Lord Cornwallis towards the end of the war. There was certainly inference amongst American commentators that they'd only lost Canada, because of course if they got it, they'd still have it. If they'd lost Canada in 1776 because of smallpox. This is a letter written by John Adams, and you probably can't read it, but here he says in a very famous comment, he'd seen the American troops come back from Canada. The smallpox is 10 times more terrible than the British, the Canadians and the Indians together. So there was a feeling on the American side that smallpox had really cost them Canada. But maybe that was convenient. In the South, the immune status of the armies was reversed a little, in that many of the American troops raised in the South, where there was a lot of fighting towards the end of the war, were immune to local diseases. So they'd have some immunity to malaria, whereas the British troops, who were hounded by the swarms of mosquitoes, found the South a miserable place to campaign, and they did have very high instances of intermittent and remittent fever. In other words, malaria, sick rates sometimes getting up to about 70%. So this subject has been turned over by historians over the years. The general conclusion is that disease in the American Revolution, as in many other wars, may have hastened the end of the war. It may have made subtle differences, but what tended to happen is that military failure, poor planning, incompetence was followed by disease. So the American invasion of Canada was entirely ill-conceived in many ways, and smallpox punished a losing army, but it probably wasn't the root cause of the failure, and the same with Cornwallis's army in the south. The real cause of British failure in the south was the battles such as Guildford Courthouse, where so many soldiers died, and also a failure to raise enough loyalist support. So disease was important, but it probably wasn't everything. There were certain groups in which disease was more common. Prisoners of war were very badly treated on both sides. This is a sketch of American prisoners of war on the British prison hulk, the Jersey. The conditions were terrible. They were cramped. There was no medical care, no inoculation amongst men who were very prone to smallpox. Diseases like typhus took hold. I mean, according to the New Hampshire Gazette, 1,700 American prisoners died in 3 days. There was a lot of propaganda, and that may be an exaggeration, but undoubtedly thousands of prisoners of war died on each side. The Americans treated the British no better. Another group of troops who had a higher incidence of disease and mortality were the black soldiers who fought on both sides in the Revolution. This is a sketch by a French officer, and on the left you see a black soldier of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which is an American regiment. Black soldiers were particularly susceptible to smallpox. And we know, again, you have to be careful with the numbers because there may well be some exaggeration, but according to Thomas Jefferson, who was usually quite reliable source, of the 30,000 Virginian slaves who joined the British Army to try and gain their freedom, 27,000 died of disease. But they weren't the most severely affected group of people. The people who were most prone to disease in America at this time were the indigenous American Indians, because they had no innate or acquired immunity to old world diseases such as smallpox. This is a hide drawing by the Lakota people. This is an Indian population, American Indian population, that currently lives in South and North Dakota, and it essentially just shows you what they felt to be the most significant event of each year. And you'll see in 1780 at the top of the first line, and 1781, 2 years of the Revolution, you see this spotted rash, which was indicative of smallpox. Mortality rates weren't documented amongst the American Indian population, but they're probably up around 90% for smallpox. So smallpox was a very dangerous disease. I suppose there's always a possibility that it could have been weaponized, it could have been used to further military aims. George Washington thought so. He'd made an accusation at the Siege of Boston in 1775, 1776, that the British had deliberately sent out people infected with smallpox into the American lines, remembering the Americans were more vulnerable to this disease. And at the end of the war in 1781, at the Siege of Yorktown, the ultimate British demise, he hadn't changed his mind, saying our ungenerous enemy has as usual propagated the smallpox. The evidence for this is weak. There is one rather incriminating letter by a British officer at smallpox saying that he'd discovered a group of slaves who he believed had smallpox, and he was going to distribute them amongst the rebel farmsteads and colonies. So, but whether that was part of a wider conspiracy is difficult to know. It may have just been a one-off. The losses of the American Revolutionary War, the Americans, again, very, very approximate, and this doesn't include civilians. American forces, 25,000, as you'll see from the asterisk comment, probably similar in some ways to the Civil War in the middle of the 19th century in terms of the impact. British forces maybe lost 10,000 men. perhaps about 1 in 4 of the soldiers who crossed the Atlantic. 80% of these deaths would have been due to disease. James Tilton, who's a good source, suggests that for every American soldier who died in battle, 10 to 20 died of camp diseases. The figures for the German forces who supported the British, the Loyalist forces who supported the British, and the French who came into the war late on the American side are probably not terribly accurate. Was there medical progress in the American war? I think it was limited progress. There wasn't a Larrey's ambulance. There wasn't a sort of light bulb moment, really. There was probably some gradual improvement simply due to exposure and experience. Perhaps not entirely obvious, the American civilian medical profession probably benefited from the war as much as anything else, because it became obvious within the ranks of the American army that regulation was important, examination was important, and so some of that professionalisation in civilian life probably emanated from the army, but it was quite subtle. The American civilian medical profession wasn't in a great state at the end of the war. According to one American historian, the American doctors of the Revolution played a more vital role than the doctors of any other war. And I think that's probably true in some ways, but it's not entirely a medical statement. Is that we know, we have to remember, of course, there were Tory, there were Loyalist doctors as well who were losers. But amongst the winners, amongst the rebel doctors, there were six of the people who signed the American Declaration of Independence were physicians. And out of the first 7 generals of the American army, 3 were physicians. So this is all very well, and it seems a long time ago, and obviously medicine is now completely unrecognisable in the early 21st century than it was at the end of the 18th century. But I think there are commonalities and things that perhaps were not as different as we think. So if we look at challenges of smallpox prevention, this is something that will resonate in this population to some extent. So if you take an American city like Boston, they tried to enforce quarantine and social distancing. They used the 6-foot rule. So in a house where the inhabitants had smallpox, 6-foot pole with a red flag on the end. There was controversial closure of schools and public buildings. Lot of scepticism about inoculation. The need to certify inoculation, who had it and who hadn't, and whether it should be enforced or not. It was enforced by Washington on the American army, but it's obviously a rather different matter in civilian life. And it hardly needs saying, does it, that some of these challenges were repeated very much in the COVID epidemic, even with a completely different disease. COVID isn't terribly like smallpox, and even with medicine that's completely unrecognisable. And the last slide is just an advert for the book on which this talk is based. You have to forgive me that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you.